In 2007, Colgate toothpaste put out an ad that said 80% of dentists choose Colgate. Amazing. 80% of dentists. So all the other brands, they share the 20%? Is that your conclusion? Is that what you would think? 80% of dentists choose Colgate. Most people perceive that to mean that everyone loved Colgate. But what actually that number 80% came from was they asked dentists, list the toothpaste that you prefer, that you like. So dentists could write down more than one name. So yes, maybe 80% of dentists wrote down the name Colgate, but another brand could have had 80% or even more than that. But you wouldn't know that just from the presentation of 80% of dentists choose Colgate. And why do I bring this up? What does this have to do with gender at all? Well, it has nothing to do with gender. But what it does have to do with that I want to talk about today is why the narrative that presents to you matters. This is something that I have noticed. I have been observing for over a decade the narrative that's presented in the media, that's presented by people who are attempting to remove the civil rights of transgender individuals. How their attempts to do it are changing a narrative. And so I want to talk to you about some of these narratives that are being presented that are changing the way people think about transgender people. And I want you to consider to question the narrative, just like considering how Colgate presented that number. It wasn't false. 80% did write down Colgate. That wasn't false. But it wasn't completely the full picture. And some of these narratives, I would even offer for you to question whether it's true or not. So, I'm going to focus this episode on the narratives that really paint a picture that is inaccurate of transgender individuals. So, the first one I have to go to is the bathroom. Talking about the bathroom bans. So, there's a focus on genitalia, repeatedly talking about transgender women in the bathroom and talking about their genitalia. First, I will say that you don't know what genitalia transgender women have or don't have or what it looks like or any of that. That's number one. But number two, the continual focus to create the imagery in the mind of genitalia. Because the interesting thing is, I don't know what it's like for you, but when I go to the bathroom, I don't see people's genitalia. I use the bathroom, I wash my hands, and I leave. And I hope you wash your hands too. The other thing is even in locker rooms. In general, in this country, we're a pretty modest country. And in general, there's a general agreement, unspoken agreement of modesty. Most people do not expose themselves in a locker room. Most people keep themselves fairly covered. At least my experience in locker rooms is most people face their lockers themselves and keep themselves semi-covered up the entire time. Not everybody, but most people do. And I have found in general that most people that have some issues with their body and some concerns with their body, some dysphoria or dysmorphia for whatever reason, for some it's gender, for some it's other reasons, tend to be even more modest and even more private. Yet, if you read the narratives, besides the continual discussion of genitalia, there is another narrative around bathrooms that keep getting brought up. I just read it again, and I don't even think it's a true one because it's a narrative that a transgender woman, allegedly a transgender woman, goes into a women's bathroom and rubs themselves. It's usually the language I read, rubs themselves. Here's the thing about that. It is illegal for anyone to go into a bathroom or a locker room and pleasure themselves. That's illegal. You cannot do that in a public facility. You cannot go into a public facility and pleasure yourself. It's illegal. So for anyone to do that does not have to do with what the law is on who can use what bathroom based on identity. It's illegal. It doesn't matter what your law is on who can use what bathroom. It is illegal for anyone to go into a bathroom and pleasure themselves. So they are using this narrative of sexual deviance and relating it to transgender identities. A story that every time I've seen the story, no proof of any truth. If it's illegal, it should be handled by legal authorities, number one. But it's not true. But yet they're getting into the minds of sexual deviants. They're creating a narrative to make you question that anyone would go into the bathroom or the locker room to do anything besides use the bathroom or change to go do the activity they are there to do. Question the narrative. That narrative doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And one time I heard testimony, I think it was in the Montana state legislation, of a story of a man that went into a women's locker room and assaulted a youth. The thing is, I knew that story. And that story happened. But the thing about the story is that was a cisgender man. That was not a transgender woman. And it had nothing to do with the law. It had to do with a criminal. He was not transgender. And this is where, as I've said before in a previous podcast, language matters. When you're saying man, 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 in this case, this was a man. It was a cisgender man that went into that bathroom. It was a man going into the women's bathroom. That was not a transgender woman going into that locker room. Question the narrative. So that's the narrative often used in bathrooms. What about sports? In sports, the common narrative is, oh, the transgender woman transitioned so they could win. Poor Leah Thomas has this spoken about her all the time. Oh, yes. She was whatever place the year before, which I don't even know where they get that placement. The year before she joined the women's team, she was on blocking testosterone and on estrogen. And prior to that, she only had practice times. She didn't have any competing times. So I don't know where they get some of their numbers that they've come up with, this 400 and whatever place. Where she actually competed when she was competing in the men's prior to blocking testosterone, she was ranked much higher. But the narrative that she transitioned to win is absurd. I mean, if that's true, she's committed because she's not competing anymore and she's still Leah. She still identifies as a woman. Question the narrative. Do you think the 10-year-old who is just so thrilled to play with their friends is doing it because they're trying to win? Question the narrative. The other narrative around sports is this huge advantage. Again, how do you present the numbers? It's the narrative. It kept being brought up that the one race that Leah got first place in, because she did place in other ones, but not first place. The one race that Leah got first place in, the 200-meter free, she beat the next person by 1.75 seconds, which is very significant in swimming. 1.75 seconds. Yet she was multiple seconds away from the record holder, Katie Ledecky. And her biggest competitor, Leah's biggest competitor's own PR was faster than Leah's time that day. Meaning, if Leah's biggest competitor had had her best day, she would have beaten Leah by more than 1.75 seconds. Her own PR was much faster than that. But that's sports, right? Sometimes you don't have your best day on the day that you need it. And for whatever reason, she didn't. So this huge blow out of the water advantage was not a huge blow out of the water advantage. Number two had a history of having faster times than Leah had that day that she won first place. And to put it in another perspective, the swimmer from Harvard that won first place in another 200-meter race, 200 backstroke, won that race by 3.81 seconds. Leah won hers by 1.7. This one won by 3.8 seconds. So it's all in the presentation. Question that narrative. When you hear 1.7, that's a lot of seconds in swimming. I'm not saying it's not, but let's look at it. What's the record? She didn't break any records. She didn't even break her competitor's personal best. And even in more recent times, there's talk about the high school student out of California, the transgender girl that won the triple jump by 8 feet. By 8 feet. I admit that sounds like a lot. So I looked it up because she got 40 feet and second place got 32 feet. And it got me curious. I was like, wow, that is a lot, right? But it got me curious. What is the record for high school girls triple jump? It's not 40 feet. It's 44 feet, 6.75 inches. I'm going to say that again. It's 44 feet, 6.75 inches. This high school student that, yes, won by 8 feet, didn't come close to beating the record. It's all in the narrative. She beat second place by 8 feet. Or she didn't get close to beating the record held by a cisgender girl. Question the narrative. The last narrative that often comes up is about the military. The military ban. Unfit, dishonorable. The military has some of the most stringent criteria to be there and to stay there and to remain there. Now, the only statistics I could find were from August 2017. And at that time, there were 15,000 transgender military service members. 15,000. And 73% of them were senior personnel, meaning they had been there somewhere between 12 to 21 years of experience. You cannot stay in the military for 20 years without being honorable, physically and mentally well. And yet, this story of, oh, well, we can't have transgender people in our military. They're not well. Yet they have historically been part of the military. In fact, a fifth of all transgender adults are veterans, making transgender people 2 times more likely to have served. But yet this narrative that keeps being said, we can't have transgender people served. They're dishonorable. Well, that's interesting because many of them are senior personnel. My point in all of this is to question the narrative. And you might hear it in my tone that I feel a bit more desperate for people to consider it because I have witnessed over the past few years, I've been doing this work for over a decade. And in the past couple years, I have seen people that have either not paid attention or people that have been moderate or even people that have considered themselves supportive, not supportive enough to maybe get educated or maybe supportive enough to have some education on gender, but maybe not know many people, or maybe they do, begin to change their stance on some of these issues. And as I listen to them speak and hear why, some of these narratives are beginning to get to them. The unfair advantage. What unfair advantage? The blowing them out of the water without breaking a record. The crudeness in the bathroom, as if someone's doing something other than using the bathroom. And now they're going after the military. The narratives of the sexual deviance narrative in the bathroom, the narrative of the competitive, physically dominant, unfair in sports, yet somehow doing that without breaking any records. Or the narrative of the mentally unwell as being portrayed in the military. None of it true. None of it with facts. Question the narrative. Figure out who's presenting the numbers to you. How are they presenting it to you? Just like when I looked up the track star, the jump, I thought 8 feet does sound like a lot. 32 to 40 feet, that sounds like a lot. And then it hit me. What's the record in girls triple jump in high school? 44 feet. Question the narrative, because the narrative matters.